The War with Spain. The main idea of this section. In 1898, the Spanish American War launched an age of American imperialism in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. So one is attached to the Atlantic Ocean and one is on the west coast, west of California. Setting the scene. President William McKinley could not sleep. Night after night, he lay awake in his bedroom in the White House. He even had to seek the help of a doctor. The president was worried about a looming war over Cuba, a Spanish ruled island just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Cuban patriots were in revolt against Spanish rule. Many Americans demanded that the president take action to help the Cubans. Almost every day, American newspapers reported stories of the cruelty and brutality of Spanish rule. The reports were often exaggerated, sometimes even made up, like fake news. Nonetheless, they stirred American anger. At first, the president resisted calls for war, but at 4 a.m. on April 25, 1898, a weary McKinley signed a declaration of war against Spain. The brief war that followed would launch the United States on its own age of imperialism in the Caribbean and the Pacific. Tension in Cuba. For many years, Americans had looked longingly at Cuba. As early as 1823, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams had compared Cuba to a ripe apple. A storm, he said, might tear that apple from its native tree, the Spanish Empire. So Spain had had control of Cuba since Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. So Spain controlled Cuba and drop it into the hands of the United States. By the 1890s, Spain's once vast empire in the Western Hemisphere had shrunk to two islands in the Caribbean, Cuba and Puerto Rico. Then, Cuban rebels created the storm that Adams had hoped for. In 1868, the Cuban people had rebelled against Spanish rule. The revolution was finally crushed after 10 years of fighting. So when the revolution is crushed, that means that the Spanish rulers stop the people from revolting against them. Some of the revolutionaries fled to New York, where they kept up the battle for freedom. Puerto Rican-born Lolo Rodriguez de Tio wrote patriotic poems in support of Cuban independence. Jose Marti worked day and night raising funds and giving speeches. In support of Cuban independence, he told sympathetic Americans of the Cuban struggles for freedom in his newspaper, Patria. In 1895, Marti returned to Cuba with cries of Cuba Libre, Free Cuba. Rebels launched a new fight against Spain. Marti was killed early in the fighting, but the rebels battled on. So Jose Marti becomes a martyr for the Cuban people's fight for freedom. Before long, they had won control of much of the island. The rebels burned sugarcane fields and sugar mills all over Cuba. They hoped that this would make the island unprofitable for Spain and persuade Spain to leave. The rebels killed workers who opposed them. They even blew up some passenger trains. In response, Spain sent a new governor to Cuba, General Valeriano Weyler. Weyler used brutal tactics to crush the revolt. In a policy known as reconcentration, his men moved about 500,000 Cubans into detention camps so they could not aid the rebels. At least 100,000 Cubans in reconcentration camps died from starvation and disease. So by burning down all the plantations and the sugar plantations, they thought that that would work, but it actually backfired. American opinion splits. In the United States, people watched the revolt in nearby Cuba with growing concern. The United States had vital economic links to the island. Americans had invested about $50 million in Cuban sugar and rice plantations, railroads, tobacco, and iron mines. American trade with Cuba was worth about $100 million a year. Opinion split over whether the United States should intervene in Cuba. Many business leaders opposed American involvement. They thought that it might hurt foreign trade. Other Americans, however, sympathized with Cuban desires for freedom. They called on the government to take action. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, they called on government to take action. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts compared the Cuban rebels to the patriots in the American Revolution. They have risen against oppression, compared to which the oppression which led us to rebel against England is as dust in the balance, and they feel that for this reason, if no other, they should have the sympathy of the people of the United States. Here is a picture, and here it says, Rebels in Cuba. This print appeared in a United States newspaper in 1896. It shows Cuban rebels leading a charge against Spanish troops. And so this is something that was probably printed by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer in their battle, which also kind of corresponds with those of you who are watching Newsies. All right, I need to stop this and save it for a YouTube video before I go on to the next segment.